We're going to be talking about how to analyze qualitative data after talking about how to collect qualitative data last week in class. We're specifically going to talk about some features and techniques of qualitative data analysis, a bunch of different alternative methods for qualitative analysis, including content analysis, computer-assisted qualitative data analysis, how you might use computer software for your qualitative data analysis, what that will do and not do, some implications for evidence-based practice, thinking about ethics, and some conclusions. So some of the features of qualitative data analysis include this idea of progressive focusing, which is essentially the researcher's actions in the analysis process theoretically are giving you a deeper and sort of progressively deeper understanding of what's going on, so that the analysis process is really meant to be able to crystallize and distill or focus in on the core essence of what it is that the data are telling you. And so that whole process of immersion into the data, of sort of entering into the data, there's a bunch of different verbs like immersion or opening up the data to sort of illustrate that to you, and using those initial steps to move through the process so that by the end you have these really concrete and distilled kind of pearls, if you will, is part of the goal. Thinking about qualitative data analysis as an art is one way to conceptualize this, in part because the individual researcher or analyst is really the entire lens through which the analysis process happens. So some of that art is connected to things like literature, where you are using text, or whether that's notes or observations or even audio or visual data, to then generate some kind of insight in a way that is more artistic than it is, or creative, if you will, than it is for quantitative data analysis, where you are relying on an existing paradigm or test rather than generating that kind of paradigm or test as a way to analyze your data. I will argue that quantitative data analysis also involves the researcher in a way that is a bit artistic, but I think it's hard to argue that they are at the same magnitude. And in fact, I think qualitative data analysis really is a bit more of a creative endeavor for that measure. A couple of the techniques that I think are important are things like documentation, conceptualization, and then a bunch of different dimensions that we talked about in the reliability and validity lecture. And if those are not ones that you've watched already, go back and watch those. The documentation, qualitative data is a pretty text-intensive endeavor, and so having all of the various contacts of the individuals that you spoke with, the interviews, the written documents, and other records, so that includes your audio files, your transcriptions of those audio files, the notes that you've made while you were in the interview, the notes that you were making as you're starting to analyze the data. There become a lot of materials that you're having to keep organized, and that as a documentation process is also so that you can go back, thinking about that progressive focus idea, to earlier stages in the process and have sort of notes, memos, journal entries, if you will, for yourself to characterize where you were earlier on in that process, so that you can understand how you sort of reached your ultimate conclusions. And those ultimate conclusions are kind of through this broad idea of conceptualizing, categorizing, and condensing. So as you're entering these data, you're immersing yourself into the data, you're starting to open the data, quote unquote, that you will initially have some ideas or conceptualizing ways to understand the data. You can then categorize those, and then ultimately you want to take those different bins or buckets of categories and condense those down into a really coherent, cogent set of themes. Maybe that's in the form of a theory, or certainly it is in terms of an understanding of the total phenomenon of interest. There's a bunch of different qualitative analysis approaches we're going to talk through, and thinking about them as serving different purposes is useful to understand so that you have a sense of what is most useful to engage in for the purposes of your research question. The first is this idea of narrative analysis, and as the name suggests, it's really about the story. This is a bit phenomenological in orientation, in the sense that understanding one person's story or experience as a story rather than an experience that could be thought of as a bunch of discrete instances that are sort of disconnected from each other and or can be disconnected. Narrative analysis would argue that the story is really at the center, and your analysis approach is to unpack and be able to tell the story across individuals and of personal biographies or a series of events that kind of connect into this larger story or narrative. And that story or narrative might be something that's quite different than a bunch of themes and how those themes hang together. But in fact, this is meant to be something, an analysis approach that's best used when there really is some kind of story to tell as understood through someone's lived experience or a bunch of sort of a chronological sequence of experiences. Ethnomethodology is something that's related to thinking about ethnography, which is often a term that's sometimes synonymous with qualitative work, though it is in and of itself a distinct analytic approach that really is focused on situating the individuals in the social world in which they live. So that's thinking really critically about things like ethnicity, gender, different intersecting identities that are socially constructed, and how the participants really come to understand and construct the social world that they're living in, how their identities are interplaying with the social world. And in the context of ethnography, that is often a long data collection process of often sort of living in the social world as the researcher, interviewer, or observer, that you're able to characterize and contextualize that social world and observe directly from the participants as well as yourself how that interplay between individual experiences and identities and the social world tends to happen. Conversation analysis is another approach that's focused really concretely on the idea of a conversation. We have a course happening now in Term 2 by Professor Park that's called Discourse Analysis, which is relatively the same thing. That's really thinking about the sequential organization and details of a conversation. So in a clinical setting, you may be thinking about a clinical encounter as a way to unpack the conversation that's happening. You may be interested in the dimensions and nuances of tone of voice, of who's speaking at what points, of different dimensions of how ideas are being transmitted back and forth, of who's doing what kinds of talking. And so it's focusing on how reality is constructed through this conversation than what the reality is. So it's using this sort of lens of a conversation and analyzing the dimensions of that conversation to construct an understanding of that reality. Qualitative comparative analysis is really thinking about how different conditions that influence an organization or individual's outcome and how those individual factors sort of present across multiple cases to produce a particular outcome. So more concretely, it's thinking about individuals or organizations and how they compare to other instances that may or may not have had a similar experience, and being able to compare those and use that sense of comparison between individual cases as an analytic approach for understanding the phenomenon. Grounded theory is sort of a grandparent of a lot of the thematic work that happens in qualitative analysis. The idea here is to really build inductively a systematic theory that's grounded in or based on the observations. So this idea really emerged out of social science that said you can't have a theory that isn't grounded in reality, and certainly grounded in a particular reality, such that we are going to use and collect data to understand the phenomenon that gets displayed as a theory. So the observations are summarized into conceptual categories, and then those are tested directly into the research setting with more observations. So this is in part where this idea came from, where the data collection and the data analysis should be iterative, where you start to understand and be analyzing the data, and then start collecting more data to continue to refine and test those assumptions and to test the ideas that the theory that you're generating is really holding weight. Content analysis is a slightly different and more quantitative orientation with text-based data, where essentially you could think about this as a useful method for something like how frequently certain words are being used in articles, or how frequently a certain phrases being used in an article, in the media, or in the way that a certain organization is describing their work. So you would set the units of analysis of looking at certain kinds of texts, and then sample from that population in a very quantitative design, construct a coding procedure of which variables you want to measure, which kinds of phrases, which kinds of words, and then test and refine that coding procedure, and then essentially use basic statistical analyses of counting and be able to articulate numerically and quantitatively how frequently certain phenomenon, words, concepts, phrases, whichever are of interest, are emerging in the particular data. So this is a pretty quantitative way of characterizing how frequently some things are coming up. And you can see that that orientation is really different than conversation analysis or grounded theory. And the different approaches are going to serve different purposes. So thinking about the analytic approach that serves your question best becomes really useful early on. The role of computer-assisted software for data analysis is something worth considering. People conceptualize the qualitative software as speeding up the process, which is really different than the way that quantitative data analysis software speed up the process of a statistical test that you could be doing by hand. The way that qualitative data analysis software speed up the process is essentially as a data organizer or a data management tool that can automate things like generating reports of all of the particular pieces of the transcripts that you have coded as a certain code. In ye olden days, where you would have cut up those pieces of the interview transcript and put them into piles based on certain codes, instead the software will let you have those codes be existing and then generate pretty automated reports to give you all of those back. So it certainly does speed things up. It helps keep you more organized, but it still requires that you as an individual, or whoever the analyst is, as an individual human, goes in and constructs that code and applies it to the text and is using that sort of human intellect and understanding as a way to analyze the data. That the process of analyzing and code and applying those codes, generating those codes, that does not get automated so much as the kind of reporting process that can happen. For evidence-based practice, we can think about different ways of aggregating qualitative data in something like a meta-synthesis. So essentially, this is a qualitative corollary of a meta-analysis or a systematic review, where you can take findings from different qualitative studies and kind of aggregate them into some larger understanding of the phenomenon of interest. So there may be lots of qualitative studies on the particular thing that you're interested in, the experience of stigma and HIV disclosure, and then potentially you want to use a meta-synthesis to make a larger understanding across that topic that's been investigated in a bunch of different studies and populations, to understand across those populations in a sort of meta way what we understand about stigma and the role of HIV disclosure. There's again a corollary for things like case studies. So case studies as a qualitative endeavor, you can also do a kind of metasynthesis across multiple case studies. So not necessarily to think about those as units that you could analyze thematically in the same way you could 30 different interviews on the same topic, so much as how to see similar themes across a variety of cases and case studies that help you to create this kind of larger aggregated understanding of the phenomenon. Ethics is really critical for qualitative work as much as it is for quantitative work, but certainly when you're using individuals' words and terms and phrases and really trying to re-represent their voices in the reporting of the qualitative findings, it can be really critical to think about things like pseudonyms or how you are representing the demographic information, and striking a balance between giving the reader enough understanding of who is providing the kind of quote that you're relying on to illustrate the point or the kind of overall theme, and how to protect the individual respondent's confidentiality and anonymity. There are other issues in terms of qualitative data analysis, things like focus groups, where you have multiple people involved, and how you keep all of the sort of group dynamics and discussions that are included. There may be things that are being shared when you have multiple people in the room that you don't necessarily want reported back out, or you want to be particularly sensitive to how that information is kept confidential and secure in terms of your own data. And then the other pieces with respect to reliability and validity on the researcher's side of being ethical, thinking about how you're using and misusing the results, how the extent to which you are really sure of your results, and what their implications are, becomes really important, especially when you are again relying really heavily on the lived experiences of individuals' patterns and phenomenon, as told by them in their own words. It's not to say that their experiences as reported in a quantitative survey are not also really important, but the fact that you're using in many ways their own words, I think really puts an onus on the researchers to pay particular attention to honoring the experience of participants, and really doing their due diligence to protect privacy, confidentiality, and ensuring anonymity.